In the summer of 64 AD, flames consumed Rome for 6 days and 7 nights, reducing 10 of the city's 14 districts to ash and rubble. As the smoke cleared and the desperate survivors picked through the ruins of their lives, Emperor Nero faced a crisis that threatened to destroy his grip on power. The people whispered that he had started the fire himself, that he had played his lyre and sang while Rome burned. Nero needed someone to blame, someone the Roman populace would accept as a suitable scapegoat. His choice would unleash a wave of persecution so brutal, so utterly devoid of mercy, that even his political enemies would be horrified by what followed. The Christians of Rome were a small, misunderstood community, practicing a religion that seemed strange and threatening to traditional Roman society. They refused to worship the emperor as a god. They spoke of eating the body and drinking the blood of their deity, and they held secret meetings away from public view. To the average Roman citizen, these practices seemed not just foreign but potentially dangerous. Nero recognized that this vulnerable minority, already viewed with suspicion, could serve as the perfect target for the empire's rage. What began as a calculated political maneuver would transform into one of history's most notorious displays of state-sponsored cruelty. The persecution that followed the Great Fire was not simply about punishment or deterrence. It became a theater of sadism, a public spectacle designed to entertain and distract the Roman populace while simultaneously demonstrating the absolute power of the emperor. Nero didn't just execute the Christians he arrested. He turned their suffering into entertainment, their deaths into art, their final moments into macabre performances that would be remembered for centuries. The methods he employed went far beyond the already brutal standards of Roman justice, crossing lines that even hardened senators found unconscionable. What makes Nero's treatment of Christian prisoners particularly shocking is not merely the violence itself, but the creativity with which it was applied. The emperor personally designed some of the tortures, turning his gardens into stages for unprecedented cruelty. He invited Rome's elite to witness spectacles that blurred the line between execution and entertainment, between justice and sadism. These weren't simply punishments carried out in the darkness of prison cells. They were public displays, carefully choreographed performances meant to demonstrate both the fate of those who defied Rome and the unlimited power of its emperor. The scale of the persecution was staggering. Thousands of Christians were arrested in the months following the fire, dragged from their homes and communities, separated from their families, and thrown into Rome's overcrowded prisons. The historical accounts speak of prison cells so packed with bodies that prisoners could not lie down to sleep, where disease spread rapidly through the cramped quarters, where the stench of death and suffering filled every breath. But the prisons were merely the beginning. A waiting room where victims prepared for the horrors that awaited them in Rome's arenas, gardens, and public spaces. The persecution transformed the Christian community in Rome from a small religious minority into a symbol of resistance and martyrdom. Those who survived would carry the memories of what they witnessed, passing down accounts of unimaginable cruelty to future generations. The methods Nero employed, the spectacles he created, and the suffering he inflicted would become embedded in Christian memory and identity, but they would also serve another purpose, one Nero likely never intended. His excessive cruelty would eventually turn public opinion, transforming victims into martyrs and a persecutor into a symbol of absolute evil. Even in an empire known for its brutal entertainments, for its gladiatorial games and public executions, Nero's treatment of Christians stood out as exceptional in its cruelty. Roman citizens who regularly attended the games, who cheered as criminals and prisoners of war fought to the death, found themselves uncomfortable with what the emperor had created. Senators who had no love for the Christian sect, who viewed their beliefs as dangerous superstition, privately expressed disgust at the excesses they witnessed. Something about Nero's persecution crossed a line that even Rome's hardened society recognized. This is the story of what Nero did to Christian prisoners in the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome. It is a story of political calculation transformed into sadistic spectacle, of cruelty so extreme it shocked an empire built on conquest and violence. It is a story documented by Roman historians who witnessed these events, preserved in the accounts of those who survived, and remembered by a faith that would eventually outlast the empire that sought to destroy it. What follows is a detailed examination of the methods, the motivations, and the consequences of one of history's most infamous persecutions. The Great Fire of Rome began on the night of July 18th, 64 AD, in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus. The flames spread quickly through the tightly packed wooden structures, driven by summer winds that turned individual blazes into an unstoppable inferno. For nearly a week, the fire consumed neighborhood after neighborhood, destroying temples, public buildings, and thousands of homes. When it finally burned itself out, more than 2/3 of the city lay in ruins. The human cost was immense, with thousands dead and hundreds of thousands left homeless, camping in the fields outside the city walls or crowding into the few districts that had been spared. Nero was at his villa in Antium when the fire began, some 35 miles from Rome. Ancient historians record that he rushed back to the city as soon as he received word of the disaster, organizing relief efforts and opening his own properties to shelter the homeless. He arranged for grain to be brought in from the port at Ostia to feed the displaced population and began planning the reconstruction of the city. But none of these efforts could overcome the suspicion that had already taken root in the minds of Rome's citizens. Rumors spread that Nero had ordered the fire set, that he wanted to clear the old city to make way for his grand architectural vision, that he had stood on a tower watching Rome burn while singing about the fall of Troy. These rumors, whether true or false, posed an existential threat to Nero's power. The emperor had always been unpopular with Rome's traditional aristocracy, viewed as too interested in artistic pursuits and Greek culture, too willing to perform in public like a common actor. The fire gave his enemies the perfect opportunity to turn popular opinion against him completely. If the people believed he had deliberately destroyed their city, his reign would not survive. Nero needed to redirect their anger, to provide them with an alternative explanation for the disaster, to give them someone else to blame. The Christian community in Rome numbered perhaps a few thousand individuals, drawn primarily from the lower classes and including a significant number of slaves and freedmen. They were followers of a crucified Jewish preacher named Jesus, who they believed had risen from the dead and would soon return to establish a divine kingdom. To most Romans, Christianity appeared to be simply another strange Eastern cult, one of many that had made their way to the capital. But certain aspects of Christian practice and belief made them particularly vulnerable to suspicion and persecution. Christians refused to participate in the imperial cult, declining to offer sacrifices to the genius of the emperor or to acknowledge the divinity of Rome's traditional gods. This refusal was not merely religious nonconformity, but could be interpreted as political disloyalty, a rejection of Roman authority itself. Their practice of calling each other brother and sister, regardless of social status, seemed to threaten the rigid hierarchies that Roman society depended upon. Their celebration of the Eucharist, which involved symbolic consumption of their god's body and blood, was misunderstood and gave rise to accusations of cannibalism. Their closed religious meetings, restricted to baptized believers, fueled speculation about what actually occurred behind closed doors. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing several decades after the fire, provides our most detailed account of what happened next. According to Tacitus, Nero deliberately shifted blame for the fire onto the Christians, ordering mass arrests of anyone suspected of belonging to the sect. The initial arrests targeted known leaders of the Christian community, but the persecution quickly expanded through forced confessions and denunciations. Prisoners were tortured until they provided names of other Christians, creating a cascade of arrests that swept through Rome's lower-class neighborhoods. The legal basis for these arrests was tenuous at best. Christianity was not yet officially illegal in Rome, though it was viewed with suspicion. The charges brought against the arrested Christians seem to have varied, ranging from arson to practicing an illicit religion to general charges of hatred of the human race, a vague accusation that essentially meant being enemies of Roman society. But the legal niceties mattered little in the climate of fear and rage that followed the fire. The prisons filled rapidly with men, women, and even children, all awaiting a fate that would prove far worse than simple execution. The conditions in Rome's prisons were harsh under normal circumstances, but the sudden influx of Christian prisoners created a humanitarian disaster. Ancient sources describe cells so overcrowded that prisoners stood pressed against each other, unable to sit or lie down. The summer heat made the stone chambers into ovens, and the lack of adequate sanitation created breeding grounds for disease. Food and water were scarce, doled out in amounts barely sufficient for survival. Many prisoners died before they ever reached trial or execution, succumbing to disease, dehydration, or simply the brutal conditions of their confinement. But for most, the prison was merely a prelude to horrors that awaited them in Rome's public spaces. Roman law distinguished between different classes of criminals and prescribed different forms of execution accordingly. Roman citizens who committed capital crimes were typically beheaded, a relatively quick death considered appropriate for those with legal status. Non-citizens and slaves, however, could be subjected to far more brutal executions, particularly if they were condemned as enemies of the state. The Christians arrested after the Great Fire fell primarily into this latter category, and Nero exploited their lack of legal protection to create spectacles that went far beyond traditional Roman justice. The interrogations of Christian prisoners were designed not merely to extract information, but to break the will of the accused and force public recantations of their faith. Professional torturers, skilled in the application of pain, worked in the dungeons beneath Rome's courts and prisons. They used a variety of techniques to compel confessions and denunciations. The rack stretched bodies until joints dislocated and ligaments tore. The scourge, a whip with multiple leather thongs often embedded with bits of metal or bone, stripped flesh from backs and left victims scarred for life. Heated metal instruments were pressed against skin, and fingers and toes were broken methodically, one by one. Many Christians did break under torture, providing names and locations of their fellow believers, sometimes real and sometimes invented simply to make the pain stop. These forced confessions created a web of accusations that led to even more arrests, even more interrogations, even more torture. But many others refused to renounce their faith, even as their bodies were systematically destroyed. These steadfast prisoners were marked for the most severe punishments, reserved for public execution, as examples to both the Christian community and the broader Roman population. The public executions began in late 64 AD and continued into 65 AD, taking place in various venues across Rome. The Colosseum had not yet been built, but Rome had other arenas and public spaces suitable for large-scale spectacles. The Circus Maximus, though damaged in the fire, was repaired sufficiently to host events. Nero's own gardens across the Tiber River became another venue, a private space that the emperor opened for public entertainments. These executions were not quiet affairs carried out at dawn with minimal witnesses. They were advertised in advance, scheduled for maximum attendance, and designed to provide entertainment to Rome's citizens. One of the most common methods of execution was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This punishment had a long history in Rome, typically reserved for the worst criminals and for prisoners of war from conquered territories. The condemned would be brought into the arena, often bound or weakened from previous torture, and released wild animals would be set upon them. Lions, bears, leopards, and other predators were starved beforehand to ensure they would attack immediately. The crowds would watch as the animals tore their victims apart, viewing the spectacle as both entertainment and as a demonstration of Roman power over both man and nature. Nero added his own cruel variations to this traditional punishment. Some Christian prisoners were sewn into animal skins before being thrown to the beasts. Dressed in the hides of bears or boars, they became targets for packs of hunting dogs that had been trained to attack such prey. The psychological torture of being transformed into an animal, of being hunted as sport, added another layer of cruelty to an already brutal death. The audience would watch as the dogs, doing what they had been trained to do, tore into the sewn skins and the human bodies within, unable to understand why their prey screamed with human voices. Women and children were not spared from these spectacles. Female Christians were dragged into the arenas alongside men, their gender offering no protection from Nero's persecution. Some ancient accounts suggest that women were subjected to sexual abuse before their executions, violated publicly as part of the entertainment. Children, too, were condemned to death in the arenas, sometimes alone, sometimes alongside their parents. The sight of young victims torn apart by beasts seems to have troubled even Rome's hardened audience, but the spectacles continued nonetheless. The frequency and scale of these arena executions turned them into a routine feature of Roman life during this period. Citizens who had initially attended out of curiosity or bloodlust found themselves growing weary of the constant violence. The sheer number of Christian victims, the repetitive nature of their deaths, and the obvious innocence of many who were condemned began to create a sense of unease among the spectators. But Nero was just getting started. The arena executions, as brutal as they were, would prove to be among the least shocking of his methods. Crucifixion was perhaps the most feared form of execution in the ancient world, a punishment so terrible that Roman citizens were exempt from it by law. It was a death designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to inflict maximum suffering, and to serve as a public warning. The condemned would be forced to carry the horizontal beam of their cross through the streets to the execution site, often after being scourged so severely they could barely walk. At the place of execution, they would be stripped naked, nailed or bound to the cross, and left to die slowly from exhaustion, exposure, and asphyxiation. The Romans were experts at crucifixion, having refined the technique over centuries. They understood exactly how to position the body to prolong suffering. The victim's arms would be stretched and nailed or tied to the crossbeam, which would then be raised and attached to a vertical post. A small wooden peg would sometimes be placed beneath the victim to provide just enough support to prevent immediate death from asphyxiation. The legs might be nailed to the sides of the vertical beam, or the feet nailed together through the ankles. Each position had been calculated to extend the dying process for as long as possible. Death by crucifixion could take days. The victim would struggle to push themselves up, using their nailed feet to take each breath, a movement that caused excruciating pain but was necessary to avoid suffocating. Eventually, as strength failed, they would no longer be able to lift themselves, and death would come from asphyxiation. But before that final moment, the victim would experience dehydration, exposure to the elements, and the constant, overwhelming pain from the nails and the unnatural position of their body. Insects would swarm around them, and birds would sometimes attack, pecking at the helpless victim's face and eyes. Nero ordered crucifixions on a scale that shocked even a society accustomed to this brutal punishment. The roads leading out of Rome, particularly the Via Appia, became lined with crosses bearing Christian victims. Ancient sources describe entire forests of crosses, hundreds of victims displayed along the major routes into and out of the city. The message was unmistakable. This was the fate that awaited those who defied the emperor, who refused to acknowledge Rome's gods. who practiced their foreign religion in defiance of imperial authority. The public nature of these crucifixions was essential to their purpose as both punishment and propaganda. Travelers entering or leaving Rome would pass row after row of dying and dead victims, a corridor of suffering that stretched for miles. The crosses would be left standing for days or even weeks, allowing the bodies to decompose publicly, their decay serving as a continuing warning. Family members were forbidden from retrieving the bodies for proper burial, a final indignity that denied the victims even the comfort of knowing they would receive respectful funeral rites. Some crucifixion victims were subjected to additional tortures before or during their execution. Prisoners might be mutilated before being nailed to the cross, having hands, feet, eyes, or tongues removed. Others were crucified in unnatural positions, hung upside down, or with limbs twisted at painful angles. Professional torturers would sometimes tend to the crucified victims, keeping them alive longer by providing small amounts of water or tending to their wounds just enough to prevent death from blood loss, all to extend the spectacle of their suffering. The Christians facing crucifixion often prayed and sang hymns as they were led to their deaths, a behavior that puzzled and sometimes disturbed their Roman executioners and spectators. Where Romans expected to see despair and pleas for mercy, they instead witnessed acceptance and even joy at the prospect of martyrdom. Some Christians reportedly encouraged each other as they hung on adjacent crosses, speaking about meeting in paradise, declaring their faith even as they drew their final breaths. This calm in the face of extreme suffering made an impression on witnesses, though it's unclear whether it inspired sympathy or merely reinforced Roman views of Christians as a strange, dangerous cult. The psychological impact of the mass crucifixions extended beyond their immediate victims. The Christian community that survived the persecution lived with the knowledge that their friends, family members, and spiritual leaders had died these horrific deaths. The roads they had to travel for daily life were marked by the crucifixes of their martyrs. Every journey outside the city became a walk through a gallery of suffering, a constant reminder of what might await them if they continued to practice their faith. Yet despite this campaign of terror, or perhaps because of it, the Christian community endured, its members bound together by shared trauma and the memory of those who had died rather than renounce their beliefs. The most infamous of Nero's atrocities against Christians took place not in public arenas or along the roads, but in his own private gardens across the Tiber River. These gardens, known as the Horti Neroniani, were vast estates that the emperor had acquired and developed into pleasure grounds filled with elaborate walkways, fountains, and artistic displays. It was here that Nero would host his most exclusive entertainments, inviting Rome's elite to witness spectacles that blurred the line between art and atrocity. And it was here that he would create the image for which his persecution of Christians is most remembered, the human torches. The concept was as simple as it was horrific. Christian prisoners would be brought to the gardens at dusk and stripped of their clothing. They would then be covered in pitch, tar, or other flammable substances, their bodies transformed into fuel for the emperor's illumination. Wooden stakes were driven into the ground throughout the gardens, creating a grid of execution sites. Each prisoner would be bound to one of these stakes, their pitch-covered bodies positioned to serve as living torches that would light the pathways and gathering spaces of Nero's evening festivities. As the sun set and darkness began to fall over Rome, Nero would give the signal for the torches to be lit. Guards would approach the first victims with burning brands, touching flame to the pitch-covered bodies. The pitch would ignite immediately, burning with intense heat and bright light. The victim would scream as the flames consumed them, their bodies providing illumination for the parties and entertainments happening around them. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air, mixing with the scents of the garden flowers and the food being served to Nero's guests. Ancient accounts suggest that dozens of these human torches would be lit in a single evening, creating a network of gruesome illumination throughout the gardens. The victims would not die immediately. The burning process could take many agonizing minutes as the flames worked their way through the pitch and into the flesh beneath. Their screams and pleas would provide a backdrop to the conversations and celebrations of the assembled aristocrats. Some guests reportedly expressed discomfort at the spectacle, but few, if any, dared to openly criticize the emperor's entertainment. Nero himself would circulate among his guests during these events, sometimes dressed as a charioteer, mingling and enjoying the festivities while Christian prisoners burned around them. According to some accounts, he would occasionally drive his chariot through the illuminated pathways, the light from the burning bodies casting flickering shadows on his face. The historian Tacitus, no friend to Christians himself, wrote with evident disgust about these garden parties, suggesting that even those who believed Christians deserved punishment felt these spectacles went too far. The psychology behind using human beings as torches reveals the depth of Nero's cruelty and his desire to completely dehumanize his victims. They were not being executed as criminals or enemies of the state. They were being transformed into objects, into mere tools for providing light. Their suffering, their humanity, their final moments of life were all reduced to functional purposes. They existed simply to illuminate the emperor's parties. This absolute reduction of human beings to things, this complete denial of their dignity even in death, represented a form of cruelty that transcended even the brutal norms of Roman society. The image of Christian martyrs burning as torches would become one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of early Christian persecution. It was described in detail by Roman historians, preserved in Christian tradition, and would be referenced in art and literature for centuries to come. The human torches of Nero's gardens became emblematic of both the cruelty Christians faced and the faith that sustained them through such horrors. Later, Christian writers would describe the martyrs as having given light, not just literally, but spiritually, their deaths illuminating the truth of their faith for all who witnessed them. For those Christians who survived the persecution but had witnessed the garden spectacles, the trauma must have been profound. They had seen their friends, family members, and spiritual leaders reduced to fuel for the emperor's amusement. They had heard the screams, smelled the burning flesh, watched as human bodies were consumed by flames, while Rome's elite drank wine and enjoyed entertainments. How does one recover from witnessing such systematic, aestheticized cruelty? How does a community survive when its members have been turned into props for an emperor's party? Yet the Christian community did survive, carrying these memories forward, transforming trauma into testimony. The Circus Maximus, Rome's largest venue for chariot races and public entertainments, became another stage for Nero's persecution. Though damaged by the Great Fire, portions of the massive structure were quickly repaired to allow for public spectacles. Here, thousands of Romans could gather to watch the various forms of execution that Nero devised for Christian prisoners. The circus had always been a place of excitement and entertainment, but during this period it became something darker, a theater of state-sanctioned murder designed to redirect public anger and reinforce imperial power. Some Christian prisoners in the circus were forced to participate in mock battles, given inadequate or no weapons, and set against trained gladiators or condemned criminals. These were not fair fights, but predetermined slaughters, choreographed displays of Roman military superiority over the enemies of the state. The Christian combatants had no training, no armor, and no real chance of survival. They would be cut down methodically while the crowd watched, their deaths serving as both entertainment and propaganda about the fate that awaited those who refused to acknowledge Roman authority. Other prisoners were subjected to fatal charades, elaborate staged dramas in which they would be forced to play mythological characters who died violently in their stories. A Christian might be cast as Icarus, bound with wax and feathers to a mechanical device that would lift them high above the arena floor before dropping them to their death. Another might play Orpheus, sent into the arena with a lyre to face real beasts that, unlike in the myth, would not be charmed by his music. These executions transformed mythology into reality, turning ancient stories of divine punishment into actual human suffering. Women faced particular horrors in the circus. Some were dressed as Danaids or Dirce, references to mythological women who suffered terrible fates. According to ancient accounts, some Christian women were bound to stakes or crosses and sexually assaulted publicly before being killed. Others were tied to the backs of bulls that were then driven mad with hot irons, dragging the victims through the arena until they died from their injuries. The sexual violence inflicted on female Christian prisoners added another layer of degradation to their persecution, using their bodies to reinforce patriarchal power structures while simultaneously punishing their religious beliefs. The entertainment value of these executions was crucial to Nero's strategy. He needed the Roman people to accept the persecution of Christians, to view them as legitimate scapegoats for the fire and as threats to Roman society. By making their deaths entertaining, by turning their suffering into spectacle, Nero ensured large audiences for these events. The citizens who attended the circus came seeking entertainment, and they received it, even if that entertainment was built upon human suffering. The spectacle distracted from questions about who was really responsible for the fire and from the hardships Romans faced in its aftermath. Yet the constant stream of victims began to work against Nero's purposes. The sheer number of Christian prisoners executed in the circus, combined with the obvious innocence of many victims, began to generate sympathy among some spectators. Women, children, and elderly prisoners who clearly posed no threat to Rome were being torn apart by beasts or killed in elaborate ways simply because of their religious beliefs. Some in the audience began to question whether the punishment fit the alleged crime, whether these people had really been responsible for the fire, whether the emperor was using them as convenient scapegoats. The atmosphere in the circus during these events must have been complex and contradictory. Part of the crowd would have been enthusiastically engaged, cheering as Christians were killed, viewing the spectacle as righteous punishment and entertaining sport. Others would have watched with growing discomfort, troubled by the scale of the violence and the obvious innocence of many victims. Still, others might have been numb to it all, so overwhelmed by the constant displays of suffering that they felt nothing at all. And among the spectators would have been Christians who had not been arrested, forced to watch their community members die while hiding their own faith, living in constant fear that they might be next. The executions in the Circus Maximus continued for months, providing regular entertainment to the Roman public while slowly depleting the Christian community. Each event would claim dozens of lives. Each spectacle would introduce new variations on the theme of creative cruelty. The circus, which had traditionally been associated with the excitement of chariot races and athletic competitions, became associated with something darker during Nero's persecution. The blood of Christian martyrs soaked into the sand of the arena floor, and their screams echoed off the massive walls, creating memories that would haunt both the victims' surviving community members and eventually some of the spectators who witnessed these events. The methods of torture and execution employed by Nero were not simply spontaneous acts of cruelty, but were often carefully planned and executed by professional torturers and executioners. These individuals were specialists in their craft, trained in the various techniques of inflicting pain and death. They worked in the dungeons beneath Rome's courts and prisons, in the preparation areas of the circuses and arenas, and in the private spaces where Nero's most elaborate spectacles were organized. Their expertise ensured that victims suffered appropriately according to the emperor's designs. Torture in ancient Rome served multiple purposes beyond simply inflicting pain. It was used to extract confessions and information, to punish the guilty, and to create public spectacles that reinforced state power. Professional torturers understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum suffering while keeping victims alive as long as necessary. They knew how much water to force down a throat without drowning the victim, how deeply to cut without causing fatal blood loss, how much pressure to apply to joints before they dislocated completely. This knowledge was applied systematically to Christian prisoners during Nero's persecution. The scourge, or flagrum, was one of the most common instruments of torture. This whip consisted of multiple leather thongs attached to a wooden handle, with each thong embedded with pieces of metal, bone, or glass. When applied to a human back, the scourge would tear through skin and muscle, sometimes exposing bone. A skilled torturer could judge exactly how many lashes a victim could endure before losing consciousness or dying. Many Christian prisoners were scourged before their public executions, arriving in the arena already weakened and bleeding from the torture they had endured beforehand. The rack was another favored instrument, particularly effective for extracting information. The victim would be bound to a frame with ropes attached to their wrists and ankles. As the rack operator turned a windlass, the ropes would tighten, stretching the victim's body. The pain was excruciating, and if the torture continued long enough, joints would dislocate, tendons would tear, and limbs could be permanently damaged. Many Christian prisoners were stretched on the rack to force them to reveal the names of other believers or the locations of their meeting places. Fire was used extensively as both a torture device and an execution method. Beyond the human torches in Nero's gardens, torturers used heated metal instruments to burn prisoners during interrogations. Iron rods would be heated in braziers until they glowed red, then pressed against skin, causing severe burns and leaving permanent scars. Some prisoners had their feet held over flames until the flesh burned away, a torture that left survivors unable to walk. The smell of burning flesh became a constant presence in the dungeons where Christians were interrogated. Mutilation served both practical and symbolic purposes in Nero's persecution. Prisoners who refused to recant their faith might have their tongues cut out, silencing the voices that proclaimed Christian beliefs. Hands might be severed to prevent Christians from making the sign of the cross or performing religious rituals. Eyes might be gouged out, blinding those who had witnessed Christian ceremonies. These mutilations marked the victims permanently, turning their bodies into living warnings about the consequences of defying Roman authority and religious tradition. The psychological torture inflicted on Christian prisoners was as carefully orchestrated as the physical suffering. Families were separated, with parents forced to watch their children tortured, or spouses made to witness their partner's suffering. Prisoners were told that they could save themselves and their loved ones simply by renouncing their faith and offering sacrifice to the Roman gods. Those who weakened and complied were sometimes released, but they had to live with the knowledge that their apostasy had cost them their community and their spiritual identity. Those who refused were forced to watch as their family members were tortured more severely because of their stubbornness. Medical knowledge, such as it was in the 1st century, was sometimes employed to prolong suffering rather than relieve it. Torturers understood how to treat wounds just enough to keep prisoners alive for further torture or public execution. They knew which injuries were immediately fatal and which would allow victims to linger in agony. This knowledge was applied strategically to ensure that Christian prisoners survived long enough to serve the purposes Nero had designed for them, whether that was providing information, serving as public examples, or participating in elaborate execution spectacles. The reaction of Rome's ruling class to Nero's persecution of Christians was complex and reveals much about Roman society and its values. The senators, patricians, and wealthy citizens who formed Rome's elite were no strangers to violence or to brutal entertainment. They attended gladiatorial games regularly, they accepted slavery as a natural part of society, and they supported military campaigns that killed thousands. Yet even among this hardened aristocracy, Nero's treatment of Christian prisoners generated controversy and concern. The historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, provides our most detailed ancient account of the persecution. Tacitus had no love for Christians, describing their religion as a deadly superstition and agreeing that they were hated for their vices. Yet even this hostile witness recorded that Nero's cruelty toward them eventually generated sympathy. Tacitus wrote that despite Christian guilt and their deserving of extreme punishment, people began to feel pity for them, sensing that they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's cruelty. This testimony from a Roman aristocrat who disliked Christians is particularly significant, as it shows that even those predisposed against the victims found Nero's actions excessive. Other senators expressed their concerns more privately, in conversations recorded in later historical accounts or implied by their subsequent actions. The scale of the persecution troubled many in the ruling class. Thousands of arrests, months of public executions, and the transformation of imperial gardens into killing grounds suggested a loss of proportion, a cruelty that went beyond what was necessary or appropriate. Some senators began to question whether Christians had actually been responsible for the fire at all, whether Nero was using them as convenient scapegoats to deflect blame from himself. The economic impact of the persecution also concerned some members of the elite. Many Christians were artisans, laborers, and small merchants whose work contributed to Rome's economy. Their mass arrest and execution created labor shortages in some sectors and disrupted trade networks. Some wealthy Romans who had employed Christian slaves or freedmen found their households and businesses affected by the sudden loss of workers. While these economic concerns were hardly humanitarian in nature, they did create another source of discontent with Nero's policies. The religious traditionalists in the Senate had their own concerns about the persecution. While they had no sympathy for Christianity as such, some worried about the precedent being set. If the emperor could persecute one religious group so severely based on flimsy evidence, what was to stop future emperors from targeting other unpopular religions or philosophical schools? The arbitrary nature of Nero's persecution, the lack of proper trials and evidence, and the severity of punishments inflicted without clear legal justification all suggested a dangerous expansion of imperial power that could threaten anyone who fell out of favor. Some members of Rome's elite expressed disgust at specific aspects of the persecution, particularly the use of human beings as torches in Nero's gardens. This innovation seemed to cross a line even for Romans accustomed to brutal entertainments. There was something about the deliberate aestheticization of suffering, the transformation of human death into illumination for parties, that troubled even hardened aristocrats. It suggested a level of sadism that went beyond punishment or deterrence, revealing something deeply wrong with the emperor's character. Women of the aristocracy were particularly disturbed by the treatment of Christian women and children. Roman society, for all its brutality, had certain norms about the treatment of women and minors. Female citizens enjoyed some protections, and children were generally seen as innocent regardless of their parents' crimes. The public sexual assault of Christian women, the execution of children in the arenas, and the burning of entire families as human torches violated these norms. Some aristocratic women reportedly interceded with their husbands to express concern about these aspects of the persecution. Yet despite these concerns and the growing sense of unease, remarkably few members of Rome's elite spoke out publicly against the persecution while it was happening. The fear of Nero was too great, the risk of being associated with his victims too dangerous. Senators who privately questioned the persecution remained silent in public forums. No one wanted to be perceived as sympathizing with the despised Christian sect or as criticizing the emperor's justice. The same aristocrats who were horrified by what they witnessed lacked the courage to speak against it, a moral failure that would haunt some of them in later years as they looked back on this period. The persecution initiated by Nero in 64 AD did not simply end. It gradually subsided as the emperor's attention shifted to other concerns and as the supply of identified Christians in Rome dwindled. By late 65 AD, the mass arrests and public executions had decreased in frequency, though they did not stop entirely. Individual Christians continued to be arrested and executed, but the large-scale spectacles that had characterized the first year of persecution became less common. The Christian community in Rome had been devastated but not destroyed, forced underground but still surviving. The long-term impact of the persecution on the Christian community was profound and multifaceted. In the immediate term, the community was traumatized, depleted, and frightened. Hundreds or possibly thousands of believers had been killed, including many of the community's leaders and teachers. Those who survived lived with the memories of what they had witnessed and the guilt of having survived when others had not. The community's meeting places had been exposed and destroyed, forcing Christians to gather in secret, in constantly shifting locations, always fearful of betrayal or discovery. Yet the persecution also had unintended consequences that Nero could never have anticipated. The courage displayed by many Christian martyrs in the face of torture and death made a powerful impression on some who witnessed it. The calm acceptance of suffering, the refusal to renounce faith even under extreme duress, and the mutual support Christians showed each other in their final moments suggested a depth of conviction that puzzled and sometimes impressed Roman observers. Some who had come to the arenas to watch Christians die left questioning their assumptions about this strange sect. The accounts of Christian martyrdom became central to the community's identity and memory. The stories of those who had died under Nero's persecution were preserved and passed down, growing more detailed and sometimes more embellished with each retelling. These narratives served multiple purposes. They honored the dead, they provided examples of faithful endurance for future generations, and they helped the community make meaning of the trauma they had experienced. The martyrs became heroes and saints, their suffering transformed into spiritual victory. The persecution also clarified for Christians what their faith would cost them in a hostile empire. Following Jesus in Rome meant being willing to face arrest, torture, and horrific death. This reality shaped Christian theology, practice, and community structure in lasting ways. The emphasis on martyrdom, on bearing witness even unto death, became central to Christian identity. The willingness to die for one's faith, rather than compromise, became a mark of true discipleship. The persecution under Nero set patterns that would be repeated in subsequent persecutions throughout the Roman Empire. For the broader Roman society, the persecution had mixed effects. In the short term, it accomplished Nero's goal of diverting attention from questions about who had started the Great Fire. The spectacles provided entertainment and distraction to the masses, and the identification of Christians as scapegoats gave Romans someone to blame for the disaster that had destroyed their city. But the excessive cruelty of the persecution also created unease, particularly among the educated elite, who began to question both the justice of the actions and the character of the emperor who ordered them. Nero's treatment of Christian prisoners contributed to his growing reputation as a tyrant and a monster. This persecution was not the only reason for his unpopularity. The emperor had alienated the Senate through various other actions, spent lavishly on his own pleasures, while Rome struggled to rebuild, and was widely suspected of having murdered his mother, his wife, and other family members. But the persecution added another item to the list of charges against him. When Nero finally fell from power in 68 AD, driven to suicide by a military revolt, few mourned him. His name became synonymous with tyranny and cruelty for generations to come. The Christian community's survival of the persecution against considerable odds gave believers confidence that their faith would endure despite official hostility. If they had survived Nero, surely they could survive whatever future challenges awaited them. This confidence was both justified and premature. Christianity would indeed survive and eventually triumph in the Roman Empire, but that triumph would come only after centuries of additional persecution, after waves of martyrdoms that would dwarf even what had occurred under Nero. The persecution of 64 to 65 AD was not an ending, but a beginning, the first major confrontation between the Roman state and the Christian Church. The historical documentation of Nero's persecution comes primarily from Roman sources, written in the decades following the events. The most detailed account is found in the Annals of Tacitus, written around 116 AD, more than 50 years after the persecution. Tacitus was a senator and historian who had access to official records and likely spoke with people who had witnessed the events or heard first-hand accounts. While he was hostile to Christianity, his account of the persecution is generally considered reliable in its basic outline, though scholars debate some specific details. Tacitus describes how Nero arrested Christians in large numbers and subjected them to various forms of execution. He mentions specifically that some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, others were crucified, and still others were burned to provide nighttime illumination. His account includes the detail that the executions took place in Nero's gardens and that the emperor mingled with the crowds in the guise of a charioteer. Tacitus also notes that despite the Christians' guilt in his view, people began to feel pity for them, perceiving that they were being destroyed to satisfy Nero's cruelty rather than for the public good. Another Roman source is Suetonius, who wrote his biography of Nero around 121 AD. Suetonius mentions the persecution more briefly, noting that Nero punished Christians, describing them as a class of men given to a new and wicked superstition. He places this punishment in the context of various other actions Nero took, presenting it as one example among many of the emperor's attempts to regulate Roman society. Suetonius provides fewer details about the methods of execution, but confirms that a persecution took place. Christian sources provide additional perspectives on the persecution, though these accounts were written even later and are more focused on theological meaning than historical detail. The early church father Tertullian, writing in the early 3rd century, references the persecution and interprets it as a badge of honor for Christianity, arguing that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Later, Christian historians and hagiographers would elaborate extensively on the persecution, sometimes adding details that cannot be verified from Roman sources. The archaeological evidence for the persecution is limited but suggestive. Excavations in and around Rome have uncovered mass graves from the 1st century containing remains that may include victims of Nero's persecution, though definitive identification is impossible. Early Christian catacombs contain inscriptions and artwork that reference martyrdom under Nero, preserving the memory of the persecution in the physical spaces where later Christians gathered. The Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican is traditionally believed to stand on the site where Peter was martyred during Nero's persecution, though this tradition cannot be historically verified. The question of how many Christians died in the persecution has no definitive answer. Ancient sources speak of large numbers but provide no precise figures. Modern historians have estimated casualties ranging from hundreds to several thousand, but these are educated guesses based on the scale of arrests described in ancient sources and the length of time the persecution continued. The actual number will never be known with certainty, but it was clearly substantial enough to devastate the Christian community in Rome and to leave a lasting mark on Christian memory. The reliability of the ancient accounts has been debated by scholars. Some have questioned whether certain details, particularly the human torches in Nero's gardens, actually occurred, or whether they were later inventions or exaggerations. The counter-argument is that Tacitus, despite his hostility to Christians, would have had no reason to fabricate details that made Nero look bad, as Tacitus generally had a negative view of Nero anyway. The specificity of some details and their appearance in accounts written within living memory of the events suggest that the basic narrative is accurate, even if some particulars may have been embellished or misremembered. What is certain is that a significant persecution of Christians in Rome took place in the aftermath of the Great Fire of 64 AD, that Nero was responsible for initiating it, and that the methods used were brutal enough to trouble even some contemporary Romans. The persecution had lasting effects on Christian identity, Roman politics, and Nero's reputation. It stands as one of the earliest and most infamous examples of religious persecution in Western history, a case study in how political convenience, public spectacle, and sadistic cruelty can combine to produce atrocity. The legacy of Nero's persecution extended far beyond the immediate victims and their communities. It established a precedent for how the Roman state would treat Christians for the next 2.5 centuries, as periods of tolerance alternated with waves of persecution. It provided Christians with a narrative of heroic suffering that would shape their self-understanding and their relationship with political authority. And it contributed to the development of Nero as an archetype of evil in Western culture, a ruler whose name became shorthand for tyranny, cruelty, and the abuse of power. The flames that consumed Christian martyrs in Nero's gardens cast long shadows across history. The transformation of memory into meaning is perhaps the most lasting legacy of Nero's persecution. The stories of the martyrs who died in Rome's arenas, on crosses along the roads, and as human torches in the imperial gardens became foundational narratives for Christian identity. These were not merely historical events to be remembered, but sacred stories that revealed truth about the nature of faith, the cost of discipleship, and the ultimate triumph of the spirit over physical suffering. Within a century of the persecution, Christian communities across the empire were celebrating the feast days of Roman martyrs, commemorating their deaths as victories rather than defeats. The early church developed a theology of martyrdom that gave meaning to suffering and death, arguing that those who died for their faith immediately entered paradise and could intercede for the living. The martyrs became models of perfect discipleship, examples of how Christians should respond when faced with the choice between faith and life itself. The stories were preserved in various forms. Formal martyrologies documented the names, dates, and circumstances of martyrs' deaths. Longer hagiographies elaborated these accounts, sometimes adding miraculous details or theological interpretations. Liturgical texts incorporated references to the martyrs, ensuring that their memory was regularly invoked in Christian worship. Visual art depicted scenes of martyrdom, preserving the images of lions in arenas, crosses by roadsides, and flames consuming faithful witnesses. All of these forms of memory-keeping served to keep the persecution alive in Christian consciousness. The question of historical accuracy versus theological meaning was not always clearly distinguished in these accounts. Early Christians were less concerned with modern standards of historical documentation than with preserving the spiritual significance of the martyrdoms. Details might be added, adjusted, or elaborated if doing so helped convey the theological truths the community saw in these deaths. This doesn't mean the persecutions didn't happen or were entirely fabricated, but it does mean that later accounts should be approached with awareness of their purposes and contexts. The figure of Nero himself took on symbolic significance in Christian tradition. He became the archetype of the evil ruler who persecutes the faithful, a role he would play in Christian literature, theology, and art for centuries. Some early Christians believed that Nero would literally return from the dead, as the Antichrist prophesied in apocalyptic literature. Others saw him as a symbolic representation of state power aligned against God's people. In either case, Nero transcended his historical role to become a timeless figure embodying opposition to Christianity. The persecution also influenced how Christians thought about their relationship with political authority. The experience of being scapegoated, arrested, tortured, and executed by the Roman state for their beliefs shaped Christian political theology. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen developed arguments about the limits of state power and the ultimate loyalty Christians owed to God rather than emperor. While Christians would eventually accommodate themselves to living within the empire, the memory of persecution maintained a prophetic tension, a reminder that earthly rulers could become tyrants who demanded worship they didn't deserve. As Christianity grew and eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the meaning of the Neronian persecution shifted again. Now Christians were no longer the persecuted minority, but the imperial establishment. The martyrs' stories took on new significance as reminders of the Church's humble origins and the price earlier generations had paid for the faith. Churches and basilicas were built over sites associated with the persecution, transforming places of suffering into sacred spaces. The martyrs' remains became holy relics, preserved and venerated by believers. The broader cultural impact of Nero's persecution extended beyond Christianity itself. In Western literature, history, and art, Nero's treatment of Christians became one of the defining examples of tyranny and religious persecution. It was referenced during later religious conflicts, invoked as a warning about what happens when rulers claim absolute authority, and studied as a case study in the psychology of persecution. The specific image of Christians as human torches in Nero's gardens became one of the most memorable and frequently referenced scenes of martyrdom in Western culture. Modern historical scholarship has brought new perspectives to the study of the persecution, using archaeological evidence, comparative analysis, and critical reading of ancient sources to better understand what actually happened and why. Scholars have examined the social and political contexts that made such persecution possible, the mechanics of how the Roman justice system operated, and the various ways different groups within Roman society responded to the events. This scholarly work hasn't diminished the significance of the persecution, but has enriched our understanding of its complexities. The persecution under Nero continues to raise profound questions about human nature, political power, and religious conviction. How could a civilized empire with sophisticated laws and culture engage in such systematic cruelty? What motivated individuals to participate in torture and execution of people whose only crime was their beliefs? How could spectators watch such suffering as entertainment? And conversely, what enabled victims to maintain their faith and dignity in the face of unimaginable horror? These questions transcend the specific historical context and continue to resonate in a world that has seen too many examples of persecution, genocide, and state-sponsored violence. The victims of Nero's persecution were individuals with names, families, stories, dreams, and fears. They were artisans and slaves, merchants and servants, old and young, men and women, and children. Most of their names are lost to history, their individual stories absorbed into the collective narrative of Christian martyrdom. But they were real people who experienced real suffering, who faced impossible choices, who died horrible deaths because of their religious beliefs and an emperor's political calculations. Any understanding of the persecution must begin and end with this human reality, with the recognition that these were not abstract theological symbols, but people who bled and burned and died. The question of whether their deaths accomplished anything, whether their sacrifices had meaning, depends largely on one's perspective. From a purely historical standpoint, the persecution failed in its immediate objectives. Christianity survived, and eventually thrive. From a Christian theological perspective, the martyrs' faithfulness unto death testified to truth and inspired future generations. From a humanistic perspective, their courage in the face of evil affirmed human dignity, even in circumstances designed to destroy it. Perhaps the most honest answer is that their deaths meant different things to different people, then and now. What remains indisputable is that Nero's treatment of Christian prisoners in the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome stands as one of history's clearest examples of how political expediency, religious intolerance, and sadistic cruelty can combine to produce atrocity. It reminds us of the capacity of state power to inflict suffering and of the vulnerability of minority communities to scapegoating and persecution. It also demonstrates the human capacity for courage, for maintaining conviction in the face of terror, and for finding meaning in suffering. These are lessons that remain relevant wherever and whenever religious minorities face persecution, wherever political leaders seek scapegoats, wherever power is exercised without mercy or restraint.